They said he had turned to stone. The villagers spoke of him in hushed voices whenever the mountains loomed behind them like sleeping giants. A hermit, they called him. A shadow. A man who had abandoned the world. For 10 years, no woman's eyes had met his. For 10 years, no tender word had brushed against his ears. For 10 years, the silence of peaks and forests had been his only companion. But solitude is never truly empty. In his cave among the cliffs, the hermit, whose name few remembered, learned to hear the voices hidden within the quiet. The wind would visit him at dusk, curling through the stone arches like a lover's sigh. The snow, falling in heavy veils, pressed against his shoulders with a tenderness almost human. Even the river, rushing with wild force, lulled him to sleep with a murmur that sometimes felt like lullabies he had half forgotten from childhood. He told himself he needed no one. That the warmth of human touch was a dream too dangerous, too fleeting. That women, their laughter, their softness, their scent of earth and rain, belonged to a world he had buried. And yet, on nights when the stars trembled above the peaks and silence seemed sharper than a blade, he would wake with his chest aching. The cold rock under him reminded him he was alone, but his dreams betrayed him, dreams of faces he had never seen, of lips hovering close but never touching, of hands reaching for him across an impossible gulf. He would rise and press his palm against the mouth of the cave, feeling the mountain breathe with him, trying to convince himself that this vast, indifferent beauty was enough. 10 years like this. 10 years of days repeating like echo after echo, until time itself blurred. His beard grew silvered by snow, his eyes sharpened like falcons from watching the sky. His heart, however, remained a fragile ember beneath the ash. It was in the spring of the 10th year when he finally descended. The snows melted sooner that season. He felt it first in the air, a softness threading through the cold, carrying with it the smell of damp earth. Crocuses pierced the white with purple and gold, daring to bloom against the frost. The hermit, restless, followed the river down the slope, his steps unsteady from years of climbing only upward. The sound of bells carried across the valley, light and bright, human sounds, the kind he had nearly forgotten. When he reached the edge of the village, he stopped, hidden among birches. It looked smaller than he remembered, as if the mountains had grown and made all else insignificant. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children ran, their laughter skipping through the air. Women hung linens that swayed like sails. Men led oxen through thawing fields. The hermit's chest tightened. This world had gone on without him. Then he saw her. She was dressed in white, the fabric catching the light as if she carried the sun itself. A crown of flowers crowned her dark hair. Her laughter rose like a songbird's note as women gathered around her, tucking blossoms into her braids, fastening ribbons to her gown. A bride. She was a bride. The hermit had not seen a woman in a decade, and now before him stood not merely a woman but the very image of spring, of renewal, of everything he had denied himself. He felt the world tilt. His breath caught, and the silence of 10 years cracked inside him like ice breaking on a river. He should have turned back. He should have retreated into his solitude. But he could not move. His eyes drank her in greedily, as though one glance could quench the thirst of years. The way she touched the petals of her bouquet, gentle as if every flower were alive. The curve of her smile, shy yet radiant. The softness in her eyes as she looked toward the horizon, as though expecting something more than just a wedding feast. The hermit pressed a hand to his chest. For the first time in 10 years, his heart thundered like it remembered its purpose. He thought of all the nights he had believed himself beyond desire, beyond longing. Yet now, with one sight of her, he felt both broken and remade. The villagers said he had turned to stone. But at that moment, watching the bride in the Valley of Spring, he knew stone could crack. He knew even mountains could tremble. And he whispered to himself, with a voice raw from disuse. 10 years without one glance, forever. They whispered of him as though he were already half a ghost. Stay away from the hermit, said the women at the well. His eyes are cursed by the mountains, muttered the old men who remembered his younger days. He has forgotten the world. He belongs only to stone and shadow. But brides are not made of caution. They are made of fire wrapped in silk, of defiance disguised by smiles, of questions too large for the answers handed to them. And she, this bride in her crown of blossoms, who the hermit had first seen laughing among her companions, had questions that burned hotter than any hearth. The warnings stirred something in her. Who was this man who had turned his back on the world? Who lived with silence as if it were a wife? Why did his shadow linger at the edge of her thoughts when she had only glimpsed him once by chance, standing at the far side of the birches, his figure half hidden yet more vivid in her memory than all the men she had ever known? That night, when the village prepared for her wedding feast, she slipped from the laughter and the firelight and walked toward the river. The moon followed her, pale and watchful. The water was swollen with spring thaw, rushing over stones like 1,000 whispers. And there he was. He did not move as she approached, though every part of him wanted to flee. The hermit had not meant to be caught watching her. He had sworn to himself that the glimpse of her in white would be the end of it. But the river had drawn him too, as though it knew their two hungers and meant to weave them together. You are the hermit, she said softly, not as a question, but as a truth. His voice, rough from years of disuse, startled even him. I am only a man who forgot how to live among men. And among women. Her eyes, glimmering with moonlight, did not look away. The question cut through him like the sudden crack of ice breaking in spring. 10 years of silence pressed against his throat. How could he tell her what her presence did to him, when even the air felt different because she breathed it? I have not seen a woman for a decade, he said at last. Until you. The river rushed between them, wild and restless. She looked at him as though the world around them did not exist, only the thrum in her heart and the ache in his chest. They say you are dangerous, she whispered, stepping closer. That your solitude has turned you to stone. But I do not see stone. Then what do you see? His voice was almost a plea. She tilted her head, her crown of flowers trembling in the breeze. I see a man who looks at me as though I am not real. You are not real, he breathed. You are spring itself, and spring does not belong to a hermit of winter. Her lips curved into the smallest, most dangerous smile. Perhaps spring belongs where it chooses. That night they did not touch, but their eyes touched 1,000 times, each glance forbidden, each silence heavier than words. When she left, he pressed his palm against the place where she had stood, as though the earth itself still carried her warmth. She came again, and again. Each time, the river bore witness. The villagers, wrapped in the gossip, never noticed how the bride slipped away, how her feet carried her to the edge of exile. Why do you return? He asked one evening, when the twilight bruised the sky with purple and gold. Because when I speak to you, she said, the world feels wider. Because in your silence, I hear truths no one else dares to say. You risk too much, he told her. A bride should belong to joy, to celebration, to the man who awaits her. And yet, she murmured, here I am. And he could not answer, because his heart was answering for him, louder than reason, louder than the mountains, louder than the vows she was meant to give to another. The day of her wedding came like a storm. The village bloomed with music, with feasting, with colors brighter than summer itself. Ribbons streamed from every doorway, bells sang from the chapel tower. She was led through the crowd, a vision in white, her hair woven with blossoms that crowned her like a queen of the valley. But her eyes searched for something beyond the festival. For him. The hermit stood at the edge of the square, a shadow uninvited. He should not have been there. Every instinct told him to turn back, to vanish into the safety of stone. But his feet betrayed him, carrying him into the place where joy blazed and where his presence was an unspoken crime. Their eyes met across the crowd. Time broke. The laughter of children, the clamor of instruments, the chatter of the feast, all of it blurred into silence. Only her gaze held him, fierce and aching, as though her soul had leapt from her body to reach his. The priest's words droned like wind through dead branches. The groom, proud and smiling, took her hand. She led him, her face serene, her body obedient. But her heart had already fled to the man who should not have been there. And then, as though fate itself had grown impatient, it happened. When the vows were spoken and the village cried its joy, she turned, not to the groom, not to the guests, but to the hermit. She stepped forward, the crowd gasping as if the earth had opened, and she crossed the distance between them as though no one else existed. "You," she whispered, standing before him in her wedding gown, defiance burning in her eyes. "If I must be cursed, let it be for truth. If I must be damned, let it be for love." And before the world, she pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of hesitation, but of destiny. 10 years of silence shattered in that single touch. 10 years of hunger poured into the warmth of her mouth. 10 years of solitude ended, and eternity began. The villagers cried out, some in shock, some in fury, some in awe. The groom's face blanched, the priest faltered, and yet none of it mattered. Because for the hermit and the bride, time had stopped. It was the kiss of forbidden love, of fire meeting stone, of winter surrendering to spring. It was the kiss that turned a man back from shadow into flesh, and a woman from duty into legend. When their lips parted, the world rushed back, loud and chaotic. But they did not flinch. They stood as though the mountains themselves had bowed to witness, as though the river had sworn to carry their secret into eternity. And with a voice that trembled not with fear but with wonder, the hermit whispered the truth that had burned inside him for too long. 10 years without one kiss forever. The years softened them, but they did not weaken what bound them. The hermit, once a shadow among stones, grew into a man who laughed again, though his laughter was quiet, like a river at dusk. The bride, once called reckless, even cursed, became the pulse of the days, her presence turning the coldest winter into something bearable. The mountains no longer felt empty. Their cottage stood at the edge of the forest, built from timber and stone. Small but strong, a shelter against storm and snow. There, they lived not as hermit and bride, but simply as man and woman, as two souls who had chosen one another above the world's judgment. Villagers still whispered. Some spat the names like a curse, others sighed them like a prayer. Mothers warned the daughters of the bride who abandoned vows. Old men muttered of the hermit who stole what was not his. Yet among the children, the tale grew softer, stranger, of two lovers who kissed once and never parted, of a bond that even time could not erode. And so, as the seasons turned, their story slipped quietly into legend. One evening, when the air was thick with the scent of pine and the stars trembled above the peaks, They sat side by side outside their cottage. The bride, her hair now streaked with silver, leaned her head against his shoulder. His beard, white as frost, brushed her cheek as he turned to her. For a long time they said nothing. They had learned that silence, shared, could be more intimate than words. At last, he spoke, his voice low but steady. 10 years I lived without, he said, his gaze on the sky, believing silence was my fate, believing love had no place left for me. She reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his, warm and sure. He turned to her then, his eyes shining in the starlight. But with one kiss, I have lived forever. And with you, I will go on living, so long as the mountains stand, so long as the river sings. She smiled, her eyes glistening not with sorrow but with joy, the kind that comes from a life chosen, a love endured. Then we have cheated time itself, she whispered. And in that moment, with the night wrapping around them like a blessing, they kissed once more. Not with the fire of forbidden longing, but with the quiet, eternal certainty of two souls who had found home. The mountains held their silence, the river carried its song, and the world, for once, seemed to bow in reverence. For theirs was no longer the story of exile or scandal. It was the story of a love that had outlived shame, outlasted judgment, and become eternal. A story that would be told not as tragedy, but as hope.